Bondi confidently declared. "The law is above politics." Jasmine quietly stood up and began playing the audio recording in her hand. Bondi's own voice could be heard. "This case cannot be allowed to affect Trump." The room went ice cold. America was shocked. The Senate confirmation hearing for Attorney General nominee Pam Bondi had been proceeding exactly as expected. Softball questions from Republicans, predictable partisan challenges from Democrats, and Bondi delivering rehearsed answers with the confident smile of someone who knew the outcome was predetermined. She had handled the easy questions flawlessly. Yes, she would uphold the Constitution. Yes, she would enforce the law without political bias. Yes, she understood the sacred responsibility of the Attorney General's office. Standard confirmation theater, performed for an audience that had already decided how this story would end. But Jasmine Crockett had come prepared for a different kind of performance entirely. For the first 2 hours, Jasmine had sat quietly, taking notes, observing Bondi's demeanor, watching for the perfect moment to strike. She had learned from her confrontation with Jim Jordan that timing was everything. That the most devastating revelations required the right setup, the right context, the right psychological moment. That moment came when Republican Senator Ted Cruz lobbed what was clearly intended as a softball question. "Ms. Bondi, there have been some concerns raised about political weaponization of the justice system. Can you assure the American people that you will always put the law above politics?" Bondi's face lit up with rehearsed sincerity. This was exactly the kind of question she had prepared for, the kind that allowed her to deliver stirring rhetoric about justice and integrity and the rule of law. "Senator Cruz," she began, her voice ringing with practiced conviction, "I want to be absolutely clear about this. The Department of Justice must be independent. It must be nonpartisan. It must serve the American people, not any political party or individual." She paused for effect, her media training evident in every gesture. "Throughout my career, I have demonstrated that I will always put the law above politics. I will follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of party affiliation or political consequences. That is my solemn oath to this committee and to the American people." The Republican senators nodded approvingly. This was exactly what they wanted to hear, not because they believed it, but because it sounded good on camera and would make for effective clips defending her nomination. "The law," Bondi continued, her voice rising with righteous authority, "is above politics. Justice is blind, and under my leadership, the Department of Justice will embody these sacred principles." The applause from the Republican side was immediate and enthusiastic. Cruz beamed like a prosecutor who had just gotten a perfect answer from his star witness. The Democratic senators shifted uncomfortably, knowing they would get their turn but doubting they could land any meaningful blows against Bondi's polished armor. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't applauding. She was reaching for a small digital device on the table in front of her. "Ms. Bondi," she said, her voice cutting through the applause like a scalpel, "I appreciate those stirring words about putting the law above politics." Bondi's smile flickered slightly, but held. "Thank you, Congresswoman. I have just one question about how that principle applied in your previous role as Florida Attorney General." The room tensed slightly. This wasn't how confirmation hearings usually went. Democrats typically saved their attacks for their designated questioning periods, followed protocol, maintained the veneer of Senate collegiality. Bondi's media training kicked in. "I'm happy to discuss my record, which I'm very proud of." "I'm sure you are," Jasmine replied, her tone maddeningly neutral. "But I'm specifically interested in one case. The investigation into Meridian University's fraudulent practices in 2019. The name hit the room like a cold wind. Meridian University, the for-profit education scam that had defrauded thousands of students, particularly veterans and low-income minorities, out of millions in tuition for worthless degrees. The case had been national news for months before, suddenly, inexplicably disappearing from headlines. Bondi's practiced smile faltered for just a moment, a micro-expression that only lasted a fraction of a second but was captured by every camera in the room. I'm not sure I recall the specific details of that case off the top of my head, Bondi said carefully, falling back on standard political evasion. Let me refresh your memory, Jasmine said, lifting the digital device. This is a recording of a phone conversation dated March 15, 2019. The participants are you, Ms. Bondi, and Marcus Wellington, your chief of staff. The room went dead silent. Audio recordings of private conversations between high-ranking officials were the nuclear weapons of political warfare, devastating when deployed, but requiring absolute certainty about their authenticity and legality. Bondi's face had gone pale, but she rallied quickly. I have no idea what you think you have there, but I can assure you that any private conversations between me and my staff are protected by... Florida is a one-party consent state, Ms. Bondi. Jasmine interrupted smoothly. Has been since 1977. Mr. Wellington was well within his rights to record conversations with your knowledge and consent. The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Wellington had recorded their conversations with Bondi's knowledge, which meant either she was aware of the recordings all along, or she had been deceived by someone she trusted. Either possibility was politically devastating. Furthermore, Jasmine continued, Mr. Wellington provided this recording to federal investigators as part of a whistleblower complaint filed under the False Claims Act. It has been authenticated by FBI forensic analysts and cleared for public disclosure. Bondi's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The confident nominee who had sailed through 2 hours of friendly questioning was suddenly drowning in 30 seconds of hostile cross-examination. I would need to review any such recording before commenting on its authenticity or context, she managed. Of course, Jasmine said with false courtesy. Let's review it together. She pressed play on the device, which was connected to the committee room's sound system. The audio quality was crystal clear. Professional recording equipment, not a hidden cell phone app. Wellington had been serious about documenting his conversations. The first voice was Wellington's, clearly announcing the date, time, and participants for the record. March 15, 2019, 3:47 p.m. Conference call between Attorney General Bondi, myself, and legal counsel regarding Meridian University investigation status. Then came Bondi's voice, unmistakable even through the compression of phone audio. Marcus, where do we stand on this Meridian University thing? I'm getting calls from some very important people who are concerned about the direction of this investigation. Wellington's response, Ma'am, the evidence is overwhelming. They defrauded at least 12,000 students out of approximately $47 million. The case is solid. We could have indictments within 6 weeks. That's what I was afraid you'd say, came Bondi's voice, heavy with implication. The room was silent except for the audio. Every senator, every staffer, every reporter was holding their breath, waiting for the bomb to drop. Wellington continued, Mom, I have to ask, are you suggesting we alter our prosecution timeline for political reasons? There was a pause on the recording. When Bondi spoke again, her voice was different, quieter, more careful, but unmistakably clear in its intent. Marcus, I need you to understand something. This case cannot be allowed to affect certain ongoing political considerations. There are people involved who are important to this administration's future success. The words landed like physical blows. Every person in the room understood the implication, but Wellington pressed for clarity. Are you referring to the fact that Meridian University's largest investor is the Sterling Education Fund, which is partially owned by... I'm not referring to anything specific, Bondi's voice interrupted sharply. I'm simply saying that timing is everything in these cases. Sometimes, justice is better served by patience than by haste. Wellington's voice on the recording carried a note of disbelief. Ma'am, we're talking about veterans who use their GI benefits to pay for fake degrees. We're talking about single mothers who took out student loans they can't repay for education that doesn't exist. These people have been waiting for justice for years. And they'll get justice, Bondi replied. But they'll get it on our timeline, not theirs. Ma'am, with respect, That's not how the law works. We follow the evidence, we build the case, we prosecute when we have sufficient grounds. We don't adjust our prosecutorial decisions based on political convenience. The pause that followed was long and pregnant with meaning. When Bondi spoke again, her voice carried an unmistakable threat. Marcus, I appreciate your dedication to the law. I really do. But you need to understand that there are bigger considerations here than any individual case, no matter how sympathetic the victims might be. Ma'am, the conversation is over, Marcus. You'll receive revised instructions by the end of the week. I trust you'll implement them without further discussion. The recording ended with the click of a phone hanging up. The silence in the Senate committee room was absolute and terrible. Jasmine looked across the table at Bondi, whose face had gone from pale to gray. Ms. Bondi, would you like to explain to this committee what revised instructions you sent to Mr. Wellington? Bondi's mouth moved, but no sound came out. The confident nominee who had spent months preparing for every possible question had never prepared for this moment, the moment when her own words, preserved in digital amber, contradicted everything she had just told the committee under oath. Let me help you, Jasmine continued, reaching for a document from her folder. These are the revised prosecutorial guidelines you sent to Mr. Wellington on March 22, 2019. Would you like me to read them aloud? Bondi found her voice, though it came out as a croak. That conversation was taken out of context. You don't understand the full what, Ms. Bondi? The full extent of your political calculations? The full scope of your willingness to sacrifice crime victims for political expediency? Jasmine held up the document so the cameras could capture it. These guidelines, signed by you, ordered a comprehensive review of the Meridian University case that effectively put the investigation on indefinite hold. 12,000 victims, Ms. Bondi. 12,000 people waiting for justice while you calculated political advantages. The Republican senators were frantically whispering among themselves, trying to figure out how to contain the damage. The Democratic senators were taking notes, recognizing that this was no longer just a confirmation hearing. It was a political execution. Furthermore, Jasmine continued relentlessly, this delay allowed Meridian University's executives to liquidate assets, transfer funds offshore, and destroy evidence. By the time your office finally moved forward with prosecution, 14 months later, the financial damage was irreversible and the criminal case was severely compromised. She paused, letting the implications sink in. Tell me, Ms. Bondi, how does that demonstrate putting the law above politics? Bondi tried desperately to regain her footing. These prosecutorial decisions are complex. There are many factors such as the fact that Sterling Education Fund donated $250,000 to your political action committee 3 weeks after you issued those revised guidelines. The number hit the room like a thunderclap. This wasn't just political interference, it was potential bribery, corruption, pay-to-play politics at its most naked and destructive. Bondi's face went white. That donation was completely unrelated to any prosecutorial decisions. The suggestion otherwise is what, Ms. Bondi? The truth? Jasmine reached for another document. Because here's the FEC filing showing the donation date, April 15th, 2019. And here's the internal memo from Sterling Education Fund's legal counsel, dated April 12th, 2019, stating, Bondi's delayed tactics have bought us the time we need. The agreed-upon contribution should be processed immediately. The word agreed upon hung in the air like a smoking gun. This wasn't a coincidental donation from a grateful supporter. It was payment for services rendered. The committee chairman, a Republican who had been hoping for a smooth confirmation process, looked like he was watching his political future crumble in real time. This was beyond damage control. This was complete collapse. Bondi made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. These allegations are false, they're politically motivated, and they're documented, Jasmine said simply, with recordings, memos, financial records, and sworn testimony from multiple witnesses. She stood up, her movement commanding the attention of every person in the room. "Ms. Bondi, you came here today and told this committee that you always put the law above politics. You said justice is blind. You promised to follow the evidence wherever it leads." Jasmine's voice carried the weight of moral authority as she continued. "But the evidence shows that when 12,000 Americans were defrauded out of their life savings, their education benefits, their hopes for a better future, you chose to protect their victimizers instead of pursuing their justice." The silence was deafening. Bondi sat frozen, her political career dissolving before her eyes, her reputation crumbling under the weight of her own recorded words. "The evidence shows," Jasmine continued, "that when faced with a choice between enforcing the law and collecting political donations, you chose the donations." She gathered her documents methodically, each movement deliberate and final. "The evidence shows that your solemn oath about putting law above politics isn't worth the paper it would be written on." Bondi's mouth opened one last time, but no words came out. What could she say? How do you defend against your own voice on tape? How do you explain away documents bearing your own signature? How do you spin financial records that show payment for political services? The committee chairman called for a recess, but the damage was already done. Within minutes, news alerts were pinging on phones across America. Within hours, the clips would be viral on every social platform. Within days, Pam Bondi's nomination would be withdrawn. But Jasmine wasn't finished. As the committee room began to empty, she made one final statement for the cameras and the record. 12,000 Americans trusted the system to protect them from fraud. They trusted that when they were victimized, their government would seek justice on their behalf. Ms. Bondi betrayed that trust for political gain and personal profit. She paused, her words carrying the weight of moral judgment. That's not putting the law above politics. That's putting politics, profit, and personal advancement above everything else, including the most vulnerable people in our society. Jasmine walked away from the podium, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any applause ever could. Behind her, Pam Bondi sat alone at the witness table, surrounded by the wreckage of her political ambitions and the damning evidence of her own choices. The confirmation hearing was over, but the reckoning was just beginning. Within hours of the hearing, Marcus Wellington was speaking to reporters on the steps of the Capitol. The former chief of staff, who had remained silent for years about Bondi's corruption, finally felt free to tell his full story. "I recorded those conversations because I knew this day would come," he said, his voice steady but heavy with years of suppressed guilt. "I knew that someday someone would ask the right questions, and I wanted to make sure the truth could be heard." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I've carried the weight of that silence for 5 years. I've thought about those 12,000 victims every single day. The veterans who trusted the system, the single mothers who sacrificed everything for an education that turned out to be worthless, the young people whose dreams were crushed by greed and political calculation." A reporter called out, "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" Wellington's answer was simple and devastating. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of losing my job, afraid of being blacklisted, afraid of being labeled a traitor to my own party. I chose my career over my conscience, and I've regretted it ever since." He looked directly into the cameras. But watching Ms. Bondi sit in front of that committee today and lie about her record, watching her claim she always put justice first when I knew she had sacrificed justice for political gain, I couldn't stay silent anymore. The impact of Wellington's revelations rippled far beyond Washington. In living rooms across America, people who had trusted the system, who had believed in the promise of equal justice under law, were forced to confront the reality of how power really works. Maria Santos, an Army veteran from Phoenix who had lost her disability benefits after enrolling at Meridian University, watched the hearing from her apartment where she was still paying off student loans for a degree that employers wouldn't recognize. "I tried to report what happened," she told a local news crew. "I called the Attorney General's office. I wrote letters. I filed complaints. They kept telling me they were investigating, that justice would come. Now I know why it never did, because someone was getting paid to make sure it didn't. The anger in her voice was representative of thousands of victims who had waited years for accountability that never came. Ms. Bondi talks about putting the law above politics, but when it mattered, when real people needed real justice, she put her political donations above our lives. In Washington, the political fallout was swift and merciless. Republican senators who had been prepared to vote for Bondi's confirmation began distancing themselves from her nomination. Democratic senators called for criminal investigations into her conduct as Florida Attorney General. But perhaps the most damaging response came from an unexpected source. Other former staff members from Bondi's office who had remained silent for years finally began speaking publicly about the culture of corruption and political calculation that had defined her tenure. Sarah Chen, a former prosecutor in Bondi's office, told CNN, "The Meridian University case wasn't an aberration, it was a pattern. Any case that might embarrass politically connected people got delayed, minimized, or buried entirely. We weren't prosecutors seeking justice. We were political operatives protecting the powerful." The revelations kept coming, each one adding another layer to the portrait of systematic corruption that Jasmine's questions had exposed. Financial records showing donations from companies under investigation. Communications showing coordination between Bondi's office and political allies. Evidence of case files being altered or destroyed to protect politically connected individuals. 3 days after the hearing, Bondi withdrew her nomination in a brief statement that accepted no responsibility and blamed her withdrawal on partisan political attacks and the weaponization of the confirmation process. But by then, the damage went far beyond one failed nomination. The American people had been given a rare glimpse behind the curtain of how justice really worked for the politically connected, and they didn't like what they saw. Jasmine Crockett found herself once again thrust into the role of national conscience. Interview requests poured in from every major network. Speaking invitations arrived from law schools, civil rights organizations, and victim advocacy groups. But she accepted only one invitation: to speak at a conference of federal prosecutors about the importance of prosecutorial independence and integrity. Standing before an audience of career Justice Department lawyers, Jasmine delivered a message that was both simple and profound. The law isn't a tool for political advancement. It isn't a weapon for attacking enemies or a shield for protecting allies. It's a sacred trust, a promise that in America, everyone will be held accountable for their actions regardless of their wealth, power, or political connections. She paused, her words carrying the weight of recent events. When we break that trust, when we allow political considerations to override legal obligations, we don't just harm individual victims. We damage the very foundation of our democracy. The applause was respectful but subdued. These were professionals who understood the daily pressures and political calculations that shaped prosecutorial decisions. They knew how easy it was to rationalize delay, to justify political considerations, to convince themselves that the greater good sometimes required individual sacrifices. "I'm not here to judge anyone in this room," Jasmine continued. "I'm here to remind all of us, myself included, that the moment we start putting politics above justice is the moment we stop being servants of the law and become servants of power." After her speech, Jasmine was approached by a young prosecutor from the Southern District of Florida, the same district where many of the Meridian University victims had lived and worked. "Thank you," the prosecutor said simply. "I've been working on cases that were buried during Bondi's tenure. Now finally, we might be able to give those victims the justice they deserved all along." It was a small victory, perhaps, in the larger scheme of political warfare and Washington power games. But for 12,000 victims who had waited years for accountability, it was everything. 6 months later, the revived prosecutions of Meridian University's executives resulted in convictions, prison sentences, and a victim compensation fund that provided some measure of restitution for the fraud victims. Maria Santos received a check for $23,000, not enough to fully compensate for what she had lost, but enough to finally pay off her student loans and start rebuilding her life. "It's not about the money," she told reporters when the settlements were announced. It's about knowing that the system finally worked the way it was supposed to. It's about knowing that someone finally listened, someone finally cared, someone finally put justice above politics. In her apartment that night, Maria called her daughter, the daughter she had hoped to inspire by going back to school, by earning a degree, by showing that it was never too late to pursue your dreams. "It's over, mija," she said, tears streaming down her face. "It's finally over. And the people who hurt us, they're going to pay." On the other end of the line, her daughter cried too, not tears of sadness, but tears of relief and vindication, and the profound satisfaction of seeing justice finally served. Because that's what democracy requires, not perfect people or flawless institutions, but enough individuals willing to speak truth to power when truth needs to be told. Jasmine Crockett had spoken that truth in a Senate hearing room, armed with nothing but evidence and moral courage. Marcus Wellington had preserved that truth in digital recordings, despite years of fear and professional risk. Maria Santos and 12,000 other victims had lived that truth, carrying the burden of injustice until someone finally cared enough to listen. Together, they had proven that even the most powerful people must eventually face the consequences of their choices. They had shown that corruption, no matter how carefully hidden or politically protected, cannot withstand the bright light of accountability. The law was above politics, after all. It just sometimes needed people brave enough to make that principle a reality. And in a democracy, that's how change happens. One truth at a time, one voice at a time, one moment of moral courage at a time. The reckoning was complete. Justice had been served. And the American people had been reminded that in the end, no one, no matter how powerful, how connected, or how protected, is above the law. Not even those who are supposed to enforce it.